Hello, hello. Welcome everyone. Sorry, I was trying to make sure my mic was working, but I'm glad to be here with all of you guys today. I will start off by just introducing myself, letting you know who I am. My name is Tia. I have had OCD my entire life. My first symptoms started when I was around 3 years old. It started off kind of sad. It was me putting myself in timeout because of my scrupulosity OCD. I had a lot of fear of not being good enough in a moral or religious sense. A lot of it, tied back to religion and God and not being good enough. And so I found myself doing compulsions like putting myself in timeout when I made a mistake or spending a really awful long time praying or asking other people begging for forgiveness from other people for very minor, small mistakes, right? That's kind of how things started off for me, and it just kind of increased and worsened from there. I experienced pretty much every theme I've ever heard of in reference to OCD. I just really went through all of them, but scrupulosity was probably always my biggest one. That was the one I always kept coming back to. That was the one, that I mean, combined with the others, but that was the predominant one that eventually made it so I was unable to leave my house. I felt really just really stuck. Like if I went out, I might make a mistake and I didn't know how to live with that. I didn't know how to live with the idea of imperfection, right? And so I always say kind of like the five that my OCD loved to harp on was scrupulosity, existential OCD, harm OCD, relationship OCD, and perfectionism OCD. And I experienced all of those from that really young toddler age, all through college, right? It was really hard. And I just kept remember thinking, like, there is something that's getting in the way of me getting everything done. I just can't function like other humans. I can't seem to clean my room or all these things that felt really basic felt super overwhelming and heavy and fairly impossible for me. And just couldn't figure it out. I'd been through therapy and it only seemed to worsen things and I didn't know why. Right. And then about 2 years ago, I was able to go and get a diagnosis of OCD. And I remember getting that diagnosis and just sitting there and sobbing, being like, oh my gosh, all of these things, I remember reading through different intrusive thoughts. Then some of them were like more taboo intrusive thoughts. And I just remember reading through that list and recognizing that I wasn't alone in having these thoughts and I wasn't alone. And feeling so much shame and so much confusion, right? Again, going through that list, reading through all the symptoms, I just remember sitting there sobbing. And then, yeah, I went and got a diagnosis and was able to do some intensive treatment, just a lot of exposure response therapy and some dialectical behavioral therapy in group settings. And it just really changed my life around. I went from being a very severe case, like I said, kind of shut in, to one now where it feels like I like to liken it, the analogy of, OCD was driving the car and I was just in the passenger seat, like, okay, tell me where to go, right? And now it kind of feels like OCD is still there, right? It's in the back of the car. It no longer gets to touch the wheel. I'm the one driving. And it's annoying and it yells at me from the back of the car, but it's just like a silly toddler that just won't shut up, right? And I am in the driver's seat and I'm the one in control. And so I just have seen the work that ERP can do and seen the progress. And now I do a lot of advocacy work and share my story mainly on Instagram. If you'd like to come say hi, I'm over there at Tortilla Wilson. But yeah, that's kind of a little bit about me. I now run a bunch of the different support groups here at NoCD, and I love doing it. So glad to be here with all of you guys, and we'll get to some of your questions and see if we can't answer. And sorry if you can hear yelling. It's happy yelling. My family is in the background exceptionally loud, but it's happy yelling. Okay, so let's see. This person is saying, hi, I need some encouragement or hope that HOCD, I think they're referencing sexual orientation OCD. We used to call it just HOCD, but that doesn't encompass all of the different sexual orientations that OCD can grab onto, is a subtype that is treatable. It's not a common subtype, and there are days when I'm losing hope. I have yet heard of success stories. I just want to say that it is a common subtype. It's a very, very common subtype, and that's because so much of us value our relationships, right? We value people. And so OCD loves to grab onto that, and help us feel really confused in that area. So you're not alone in feeling those, intrusive thoughts and obsessions and compulsions in reference to your sexuality. That's exceptionally common. That was one of my subtypes, right? It was something that kept me up at night. I remember especially in junior high, that was when a lot of that came up for me. It's kind of when everyone was starting to explore their sexuality a little bit more, and I just felt a whole lot of confusion and a whole lot of shame and this need to figure it out. I want to point out that the difference between someone who's just, wanting to explore their sexuality and the way OCD tells us to explore our sexuality is this urgency and this fear and this shame that accompanies it. It's kind of like you have to figure out for certain, 100% certain, what label you fall under. Otherwise, total catastrophe will occur, right? And so it's this urgent feeling, and I know it can feel so overwhelming and so scary in the minute. But there is hope, right? I'm living proof that there's hope where I'm now able to live and not have so much need and urgency for certainty surrounding my sexuality. I can kind of live and identify with labels and just have more nuance to my sexuality, the way that I value. And there's not any need to figure it out right now, right today. And so there's definitely hope there. Um, let's see. I haven't figured out how to give myself more grace when I take two steps back or I'm not moving forward as quickly as I would like. Do you have words of wisdom? That is so hard. One thing OCD just freaking loves is shame. It loves to make you feel stuck in this space where you don't have a whole lot of self compassion, right? Things feel really heavy and urgent. Like I said, it feels like total catastrophe will occur if you don't figure things out. And OCD loves to grab onto different threats, right? Threats to our physical safety, our emotional safety, our social safety, our spiritual safety. It loves to just tell us that you know, that we're stuck and we're afraid. And so I know that when we're working on learning more about our OCD and combating it, it can feel like we have a lot of times where we fall a couple steps back, right? That's really normal, but it's hard to remember that that's normal. One thing I think that's helpful to recognize is that you've had OCD for a long time. Most of us have had it for years, maybe even decades, right? And so it's not going to change overnight. One thing that I think is really, really cool about those of us with OCD is that we have a really high level of insight. And that means we're able to kind of see our OCD for what it is, right? We're able to recognize our intrusive thoughts. We're able to recognize our compulsions. And that can be really, really powerful in terms of treatment, but it can also be really tricky because it makes it feel like, I'm able to recognize all these things. Why can't I change them overnight, right? I know what I'm doing wrong, so why am I still doing it wrong? And it's just so vital to again remember that you've had OCD for a while. It's not going to go away instantly. And practice makes perfect. And so a lot of the times people think of self-compassion as this like destination. Like one day you just wake up and are like, I am wonderfully self compassionate, right? But that is not the way it works. Instead, it's this very daily and mindful process, right? It's every time you put yourself first. That's self compassion. It's every time you show up to therapy, even when you don't want to, even when you've had a really hard day. That's self compassion. It's every time you let an intrusive thought be there and you don't engage with it. That's self compassion. Every time you spend time with family and friends and loved ones, that's self compassion. Every time you explore your values and use them to drive your ERP treatment, that's self compassion. And so pat yourself on the back for those little moments every day that you are being self compassionate because that's the goal. The goal is to intentionally practice the same way you would in any relationship, anytime you're loving on the other person, right? So celebrate those little wins and recognize that we're not going to be able to reframe things overnight and we're not going to be able to get rid of the shame overnight. And so instead, we can focus on our actions while we work to change the way we feel and believe about ourselves. Let's see what other questions we've got here. What to do when you've depersonalized and your harm OCD gets worse because of it? This is a really great question. A lot of us with OCD also experience trauma. Sometimes that is the onset trigger for us. And maybe we just, have the trauma from having the lived experience of OCD, which can be so hard. And a lot of us might deal with things like dissociation. So, dissociation is just anytime we've kind of pulled back mentally from our surroundings, from ourself, we're trying to pull back so that we don't have to feel, right? That's really what dissociation is. And so, depersonalization is a form of that where it feels like you aren't real. Maybe you as a physical human don't there's some disconnect. It feels like maybe you don't exist. You might not recognize yourself in the mirror. It can just feel really dark and really scary. You might also experience derealization where it seems like your surroundings aren't real. And those are things I really dealt with my OCD. Like I said, there's sometimes the trauma from having just the lived experience of OCD and thoughts we don't understand, especially when they happen at a very young age. It can feel exceptionally confusing and scary. And so I went through a period of 2 years when I was 13 and 14 where I just completely dissociated. I don't really remember much. And it's that your mind trying to protect you, right? It's trying to pull you away and numb you so that you don't feel. And I know that when you're experiencing things like depersonalization or derealization, it can make those other subtypes like harm OCD or existential OCD a lot harder, right? It can make it feel it can make it really hard to ground and to feel your emotions and let yourself sit through the distress because that's the goal of OCD is to be able to sit through our distress without pushing it away. But it can be hard to sit with it altogether when you have the dissociation. And so, one thing I would recommend is talking with your therapist, expressing to them that this is something you deal with, and asking for different tools that you can use because sometimes when we have the trauma and the OCD, we've got to handle things a little differently and maybe work on the trauma first and then work on the OCD, right? And so if you bring that up with your therapist and kind of make a plan, that can be really, really helpful. Um, let's see. Um, duh. Okay. So it says, can it be OCD if the obsession causes anxiety, but it's true? OCD seems to surround uncertainty. However, a lot of my obsessions involve things like humans are just cells and chemicals. So, one thing that's kind of tricky about OCD is that it can be about things that are true, right? A lot of us had OCD flare up during COVID, and there was a very real risk that OCD was grabbing onto, right? We believed that COVID is really really scary, and we knew we needed to do things to protect ourselves from it, and so OCD grabbed onto it. It doesn't necessarily, OCD doesn't always grab onto things that are illogical, right? But they can the part that is illogical is the urgency again and the intensity of the emotion. And so if you're able to notice those two things, it can help you identify when OCD is grabbing onto different areas of your life. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It really truly doesn't. A lot of us experience scrupulosity, right? Where our OCD is grabbing onto our morality. And sometimes our moral code is a good one, right? It's a good idea not to destroy the planet, right? It's not ideal to be throwing trash everywhere and being haphazard in regards to our planet. But OCD can take that a step further and make us feel this urgent and hyper responsibility for fixing it, right? Where it's like, if I don't fix it, no one will. And it can do that with anything, relationships. Sometimes, it is good to be mindful of our relationships and ways that we're feeling in reference to our partners, but OCD can grab onto that and take it to an extreme. So it's not so much about whether something is true or not. Um, OCD, like you said, about uncertainty. It's also about catastrophe, right? And it can just sometimes be about a feeling of just something's not right, and I don't like it. I don't like this feeling that I'm feeling. I want to push it away. Um, and so a lot of what you just described, the obsessions involving things like humans are just cells and chemicals, that sounds like it could also tie into some existential OCD where you're worried about how real our human experience is because of those things, like that we're cells and chemicals, right? And so you're able to do some exposures maybe with that, do some different exposures where you're leaning into the uncertainty of, yeah, maybe things don't matter. Maybe we are just cells and chemicals, and sitting with the distress that's there. And that's how we would do ERP for that. That's a really great question. Let's see. My relationship OCD has made me obsessed with my boyfriend's intentions in every situation, and I'm obsessed with the idea that I'll never really know. How do I learn to trust over OCD? Right. So that's the one thing about relationships, right? Is that we don't ever really know. We don't ever 100,000% know we can trust someone, right? And so part of being in a relationship is having that trust. And it can be so hard that OCD likes to get in that little gap of things that we don't know and focus there. And it can take us away from the things that we do know, right? We might love spending time with our partner. We might know that we enjoy their company and value the growth you experience together. But then there might be this little teeny margin of uncertainty, and that's where OCD will sit. And it's really hard when it feels like all of your thoughts are now encompassed by this little margin of uncertainty instead of all of the good things that you know. And so a lot of, what helps with that, like every type of OCD is exposure therapy. I think it's really important to recognize, that there's so many different subtypes of OCD. Like I said, I've had all of them, at least all of the ones I've heard of to some degree at some point, right? And it can feel overwhelming when you're like, I have relationship and harm and um, pedophilia and sexual orientation, and right, it can just feel overwhelming when you have this long laundry list. But it's important to recognize that it's all OCD and it's all treated like OCD, which is treated the same, right? And so what we do for that relationship OCD is what we do for any type of OCD, which is doing exposures where you're practicing not engaging with those thoughts. So when your OCD says, "Hey, you need to check your partner's phone in case that they're being unfaithful or not being loyal," you don't check their phone, right? When your relationship OCD says, "Hey, you should not go to the grocery store in case you see other, other people and are attracted to them and are being disloyal by being attracted to a stranger," you go to the grocery store, right? We do that opposite action. Just taking those thoughts and everything OCD is telling us to do and doing the opposite. And it trips up OCD and makes it really hard for those thoughts to stick. Um, and we don't give those thoughts credit, right? We let ourselves sit with the uncertainty of, yes, the worst case scenario, whether that's them cheating, them dying, whatever it is, that might happen. And we sit with that. And I know how scary and overwhelming and gross that sounds, right? But that's how we combat it is the intentional sitting with the distress instead of engaging with it. One thing I always like explaining is the OCD cycle. So we have this beautiful alarm system in our brains that tells us when we're in danger, and it does things like get the blood pumping to our arms and legs so we're ready to run. It increases our heart rate. It makes us breathe faster so we can get more oxygen, right? Our bodies have this really beautiful way of preparing us for danger. I like to give the example of cavemen. And the first time a caveman saw a bear, he was like, "Oh, he's so cute and fluffy." And then he saw his friend be eaten by a bear, and he was like, "Okay, less so. I should run away," right? And he runs away. And the next time he sees a bear, it's even quicker, right? His brain goes, "Bears, scary, run." And so he runs away. And the next time he sees a bear, it's even quicker. And it's bear, scary, run, bear, scary, run. And he gets quicker and quicker and quicker until it's just like bear, run, bear, run, right? And unfortunately, OCD can do that when it's not a bear. OCD is when we're having false alarms going off in our brain, and they feel just as real as the real alarms, right? And so we're doing bear, run, but it might be butterfly, run. And we've just created this cycle where because we keep running our because we keep running away, our brains have learned, oh, this is something scary. Otherwise, why would you be running, right? And so we have this cycle of, okay, I have this threat, it scares me or gives me some type of distress. Maybe it makes me angry or disgusted or scared, whatever it is. So to get rid of that distress, I have this urge to neutralize it. And so I neutralize it by doing a compulsion. And when I've done that compulsion, it reconfirms that this is a genuine threat. And then the next time it goes even faster. We have this threat, we have the distress, we have the urge to neutralize it, we neutralize it, it confirms that the threat is real. And then it goes and goes and goes even faster until it's just simply this threat, neutralize, or threat, compulsion, right? And so that is kind of, just the way OCD works in all of these different themes. If we're able to recognize that cycle and recognize that the one piece that we get to control is not the distress, we don't get to get rid of the distress. The distress is there. The piece we get to control is when we have the urge to neutralize, when we have the urge to do a compulsion, we don't do it, right? That's the piece that ERP comes into play. And so that applies to all of these different themes people are asking about. including the relationship OCD. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful, and we'll go through some of these other questions. Let's see. Um, how can I stop being nervous when OCD hits? That's a really great question. A lot of us have learned, right, through that same process I just described, that our distress is something we cannot manage, that we cannot possibly sit through our distress. We have to do things to push it away, right? And so what we're trying to do is train our brains that we don't, that we can have the distress and we can not neutralize it with our compulsions, and it will go away on its own. And so what we can do is practice sitting with distress. We can sit with it all the time. There's so many opportunities to sit with it. And you can also look and see, what symptoms does my OCD cause that stress me out? So maybe it's that it makes you a little shaky. Maybe that it makes you feel short of breath, right? Whenever you have the OCD, what is it that makes you distressed? Is it the body sensations, the shakiness, the short of breath, or is it your own mental responses? And then we can practice sitting with it. So if we are scared because OCD makes us sweat and we don't like that feeling, then we better go exercise before we leave the house so that we're already sweaty and so we can learn to deal with the sweatiness, right? If we have this fear because OCD makes us feel dizzy because we're so stressed out, let's spin around in our chairs and practice getting dizzy and then practice sitting with it. If we just don't like it because it feels real and we have to engage with our thoughts and it feels like we just can't push them away, what we might do instead is labeling what emotion we're feeling, noticing where it sits in our body, and then practicing sitting with it, right? And the more we do that, the more we teach our brains that this is a false alarm by not engaging with the urge to neutralize or the urge to do a compulsion. That's how we fight back, right? And so hopefully that can help you to not feel so nervous when it hits. And guess what? Even if you are nervous when it hits, that's the perfect thing to sit with, right? Our goal is not to get rid of our distress, it's to learn how to tolerate it without pushing it away. And so you might just be nervous when the OCD hits. And what you can do is learn how to sit with that, right? And still do things that are values consistent and that are effective in your day, without having to push it away. Let's see what other questions we've got. Um, One person said, let's see. I'm trying to see if other people have similar obsessions. Mine are unusual. One theme centers around pets, those who have come and gone and are in a better place. I just want to say that, truthfully, I don't think there's any unusual obsessions. At least none that I've heard. Almost all of the obsessions I've ever heard are ones, again, I dealt with at some point. Our OCD wants us to feel like we have such a rare case that no one could ever possibly understand. But I just want to say that, it's that's not the case. A lot of us are experiencing these thoughts that just feel so unusual and so absurd. But really, I'm sure there's other people who have had these thoughts, right? Um, and so, oh, you said like the feeling that I brought home the wrong cat from boarding and taking the wrong dog home from the dog park. Yeah. So that's another example of a time that's a real life scenario. You just got your dog back from the dog park or something. And you have this distress coming on, and this is a very real time that you can practice sitting with the distress, right? Practice sitting with the idea that maybe you did and just letting that distress be there without pushing it away. And if that feels too overwhelming, then maybe we practice building, an exposure hierarchy with the therapist where we're starting with something a little smaller, distress that's a little easier to sit with, and then we build up until we're able to sit with the distress of maybe you did bring the wrong dog home, right? I know it feels counterintuitive and yucky to just practice sitting with these gross feelings. It feels overwhelming, right? But it doesn't mean that these feelings are bad. They're just feelings and they don't get to control your actions, right? And so the more we're able to do the exposure response prevention, and again, this doesn't just happen overnight, the more we're able to sit with our distress without pushing it away. Um, oh, okay, this is a really good question. I have currently been going through my OCD for 2 weeks now. Um, it gets hard. It really does. My question is, how do you learn to accept that this is a lifestyle change and ERP is not just a magical cure? Ugh. I feel that one. A lot of us with OCD have this um almost like fixation, this obsession with finding the magic bullet, this magic bullet that will just, you know, fix everything, right? And we hope for it. Sorry, we hope for it and we have this intense urgency to find it, right? And so it can be really hard when we hear what ERP actually is and that it is a lifestyle change. I still do ERP every day, even though I'm in recovery and my OCD used to be a 9 or 10 out of 10, and now it's like a 1 or 2 out of 10. It can feel still like, you know, I still am doing the ERP even when it's down this low, right? It is a lifestyle change. And I think that at first that's something that you get to mourn, right? It is sad. It's sad there isn't some magic bullet. I mean, I wish there was. I would love to give it to everyone, right? But there isn't. And so you can have this little piece of letting yourself feel what you're feeling, even if it is sadness, right? Um, and then also acknowledging that there's a lot of good that can come out of that. I didn't see that at first, as I went through ERP, it took again months of intensive outpatient, months and months of just hard work, some flare-ups, some relapses, right? And now I'm at a place where again my OCD is really stable. Sorry, I have a tickle in my throat. Um, I'm at a place where my OCD is really stable. But the one thing that's kind of funny is I'm again still doing the exposures and I'm able to see how much it increases my quality of life even with my OCD being so low. Just being able to face my fears and know that I don't have to act on my emotions is incredible. And that's something that whether or not you have OCD, that's not something a lot of people understand, right? That they don't have to act on their emotions. We always say follow your heart, and that's nice, but we also need to follow our heart and our mind. We need to do this kind of wise mind where we listen to our emotions, we let them inform us, and then we make decisions that are most effective for our current situation and that are most in alignment with our values. And so I think that that separation is powerful. And, even if you didn't have OCD, I think everyone benefits from exposure therapy. I've been, just living my exposure therapy, just kind of really openly telling my friends, oh, I'm doing exposure right now, or hey, I'm scared of this, so I'm going to go do it. Would you like to come? Right. And my friends have found a lot of value from it, even when they don't have OCD. And so I think that it can be a really exciting lifestyle change. If you look to it, oh my goodness, this tickle in my throat. So sorry. It can be an exciting lifestyle change if you look at it as something that's adding to your life instead of something that's taking away, right? It's not taking away from your life by, taking a couple hours out of every day to do exposures. It's adding to your life by giving you this ability to recognize your emotions and not act on them, and to sit through distress and to do things that scare you, because that's freaking incredible. How many people are out there right now, like waking up in the morning, conquering their biggest fears? That's so cool that that's what we're all doing, right? When we go through ERP, that's what we're doing. And so I think it can be a really exciting lifestyle change, and it can embody you or help you to embody your values a little bit more and to practice living a life that feels really, really good and really conducive to your goals, right? Oh my goodness. Might need a cough drop or something. So anyway, if you're able to look at it as something exciting, I think that can help a little bit. But also let yourself mourn and let yourself feel what you're feeling. I'm so sorry. One second. Good grief. Oh my gosh. Um, okay. Let's see. So this person is saying, I know it sounds weird, but it feels like things that I like and enjoy are starting to trigger me with anxiety. Every time I see something I like, my heart stops, and I don't know why. Is this OCD or something else? I don't fully know, what's causing that initial reaction where your heart stops, but the fixating on it and worrying about it could definitely be the OCD, right? Maybe it's just that it's exciting and so your heart leaps a little in your chest, or maybe, who knows what it is, but it sounds like because you're worried about it and trying to figure it out and it feels, maybe that you feel this urgency to figure it out, then that's probably the piece that's OCD. And so instead, what we can practice is letting that feeling happen and not trying to figure it out, not Googling it or trying to ask other people for reassurance or see if they understand what it is you're feeling, right? We're just going to let that feeling be there and keep doing what we were doing before and keep just living, right? And not having to stop and figure it out. Um, can paranoia be linked to uncertainty and OCD? I constantly question people's intentions and wonder if it's because I'm trying to protect myself or something else. Yeah, definitely. OCD can make us look and act very paranoid, right? And feel very paranoid because it's constantly looking for threats. That's OCD's job, right? Like I said, it's sending false alarms to our brain of these different threats that it's found. And so it's kind of just like it's just like a broken alarm system. And so it's going to go off times that maybe it wouldn't for other people. And so it might make you look paranoid, right? And it's just looking for danger. And so if we're able to recognize that OCD will send us false alarms, then we can practice doing the opposite action and practice doing ARP with it. Um, let's see. I have just right OCD and it's hell. Best advice on what to do when it makes you question or doubt things you're happy about that you did. I recently had an old obsession come back relating to it. Oh, it can feel so hard when we have these areas of our life that are going well by most people's standards, but not by our OCD standards, right? Where it's like you did something good, but not good enough for the OCD. And so I think it's so vital to remember that OCD will always grab onto those little areas where you could have done better. And unfortunately, OCD standards are way up here. And so it might always feel like you could have done better. One thing to just remember is this idea of expecting and accepting. Expect that your OCD will grab onto those times and then accept it when it does, right? And that can make it feel a little less scary and a little less frustrating and personal when it just jumps out of nowhere and grabs onto the work you do. Expect that it's going to be there, accept it, and then continue to pat yourself on the back for what it is you just did. Keep Oh my goodness. So sorry, you guys. Feels like I swallowed a feather. It's not very comfortable. But keep patting yourself on the back. Keep celebrating. Celebrate alone and then bring other people and let them celebrate with you. And kind of just let yourself feel those moments even with the OCD that's still there saying, hey, you didn't know you could have done better, you could have done better. It's always going to be on your shoulder whispering about how much better you could have done. But instead, celebrate, right? And someone asked what just right OCD is. And just right OCD is any time that your OCD is grabbing onto something as a threat just because it doesn't feel right. Right? There might not be any like specific reason. It might not be like, oh, if you don't move this pencil, your mom's going to die, right? It'll be like, oh, if you don't move this pencil, it just won't feel right. So you should move it until it feels right. Um, and so we can do a ton of different compulsions, but again, the threat there is this feeling of things not being right, and this idea that we can't sit with the feeling of things not being right. It feels really uncomfortable. We might get really stressed out and feel like we can't sit through it. And so we combat it with ERP and by practicing sitting through the feeling of doing things not just right, but doing things wrong and then sitting through the distress of it, right? And that teaches our brains that we can feel uncomfortable and feel like something isn't just right, and we don't have to change that. That's okay. We're allowed to feel that. Um, it doesn't have to tell us what to do, right? And so yeah, that's kind of what just right OCD is, but it can grab onto any type of compulsions. It might be like, oh, you have to kiss your significant other until it feels just right, or you have to, um, only eat these certain grapes and not others because those grapes didn't feel just right. That was one I had. That's a random one, but I would eat grapes and be like, this one doesn't feel right. Let me spit it out and try a different one, right? And so instead, again, what we practice is eating the grapes that feel not right and kissing our partner the number of times that doesn't feel right, and just sitting through the distress that's there. And again, you can start with really small exposures to do that. We don't have to just jump to ones that we don't feel like we can handle, but we just start with the small ones and we build our way up. um let's see. Yeah, so this person, Lauren, just said, I have just right and magical thinking. I can feel if I pick out the wrong soap at the store, I'll lose my job or something generically bad will happen. Would love not to feel that. Yeah, I think it's valid that you love not to feel that, right? It's frustrating when we feel this that are these little teeny actions we're doing have such huge consequences. But, the goal with OCD is not to get rid of the feeling, it's to get rid of our responses. So we're able to still look at, I go to the store and because my OCD still does this, right? I'll go to the store, grab a soap, and my OCD is like, that's the wrong one. You should grab the second one in the stack, right? And so now I'm like, okay, I hear you, OCD. Thanks for your feedback. And I still grab the initial soap I was going to grab, and I leave the just right one. And so that's just a really small, I think, example of what recovery looks like. It doesn't look like our emotions going away. It doesn't look like our distress going away. It looks like us learning how to deal with it. And now, like, because I've, done that so many times, my distress has gone down. And, before it felt super urgent that I picked the right soap because that's genuinely when I had to. It was felt so urgent and so important. And now it's kind of just like my OCD is like, "Aw, you should have picked the other soap," but it just kind of loses power the less you engage, right? But yeah, again, our goal is not to get rid of our emotions, it's to practice sitting with them. Let's see. Yeah, okay. This person says, sometimes I feel good. However, when I wake up in the morning, I ask myself, did it go away? That's the OCD cycle. Then the OCD cycle begins. How do you stop from checking on yourself? That is a really good example of a mental compulsion. A lot of our compulsions are mental, right? They're not these visible compulsions we're doing that we sometimes see in mainstream media. While they can be external and definitely are for so many people, some people only experience those compulsions that are mental. And so one of those mental compulsions is this checking on ourselves. Like, oh, how do I feel in reference to this threat that I used to have? Has it gone away? Let me think about it and see how I feel. Um, I think a really good way to stop ourselves from engaging with those mental compulsions, I always say to slow it down. And so what that looks like is practicing learning that false alarm model that we talked about earlier, where we have our, initial threat, whatever it is. And then we have this distress that comes on, the urge to neutralize it. We do the compulsion, it confirms the threat. And I kind of have this written down for myself on a piece of paper that just walks me through that entire model. And I'm able to point to the different areas and recognize what my brain is doing at every step of the way. And then it makes it feel less like it's just an automatic thought process. And I'm able to see what my brain is doing, right? So in this case, it might look like, okay, the threat is I realize that I haven't been thinking about, um, my sexual orientation OCD in a while, right? So I wake up in the morning, realize, oh, I haven't thought about my sexual orientation OCD in a while. The distress comes where I'm like, oh, I don't want to have to deal with that. I don't want to think about it. I have this high distress. I have this urge to neutralize my distress by checking if it's gone, right? Checking how I feel, checking if I still have this response to these different sexual orientation triggers, right? And so then I have the compulsion of checking in with myself, checking in, doing quizzes online, whatever it is I'm doing to try to confirm that I don't have a sexual orientation OCD, and that will confirm the trigger or confirm that this is a threat, right? And I'll genuinely just take out this piece of paper that has this false alarm and I will walk through it every step of the way. Okay, I'm having this urge to check and figure it out. I'm not going to do that, right? And then I'm able to go and do something that's more mindful. And so when you're able to have this false alarm model, it can help you slow things down and recognize what your brain's doing so it doesn't feel so automatic. If you want, um, I just made a printable version of that false alarm model. If you message me on Instagram at Tortilla Wilson or email me here at Tia Wilson at nocdhelp.com, I can send it to you guys. Um, yeah, yeah, definitely shoot me an email or message me there if you'd like that false alarm model. But I always just say slow it down. So whether, oh my goodness, you guys, this little feather in my throat is killing me. If you guys are able just to slow it down by walking yourself through what it is your brain's trying to do, I think that can be really helpful. And then again, mindfully redirecting. So when you have that urge to figure it out, instead be like, I'm gonna go have some breakfast, right? Going and doing something that is more consistent with what your actual goals are for the day instead of letting OCD trip you up. Um, let's see. What causes OCD? Bill is asking. There's a couple things that can cause it. A lot of it is genetic. A whole large portion of it is genetic. It can also be brought on by bacterial infections. So that happens a lot with kids, things like strep throat. It's very rare though that it's a bacterial infection, but it can be brought on that way. Some women also experience it postpartum. Or excuse me, people with vaginas can also experience it postpartum if they had a baby. And there's some other things that can cause it. And then a lot of the time, we have this genetic predisposition for it, but it doesn't start until there's a trigger sometimes. So sometimes we'll have like a traumatic incident or just something that's really overwhelming, a large change, and that's when our OCD will spike and pick up, right? And so, um, it's something that OCD likes to grab onto. We like to try to figure out what caused it. We want certainty about why we have OCD. And so if you find yourself in that boat where you aren't satisfied with the answer I just gave and are like, no, I need to figure out exactly why I have it and exactly who gave it to me and exactly, like genetically who gave it to me and all this stuff, recognize that OCD might be grabbing onto it and try to sit with the uncertainty of who knows, maybe we don't know where it came from, right? Um, can avoiding potential confrontation be a compulsion? Yeah, anything can be a compulsion, really. If our intention is to get away, or again, remember this false alarm model. If our intention is to get away from our distress, it can be a compulsion, right? And so some tasks, some things we do every day might not be a compulsion some days and might be a compulsion the next, right? So I've had brushing my teeth be a compulsion where it was like I was brushing my teeth because I had this really huge fear that all my teeth were going to fall out, right? That was the time it was a compulsion. Other times I was just brushing my teeth because it's a good hygiene skill. And that was a time that it wasn't OCD. So it all comes down to the intention that's there. And sometimes it can be both. Sometimes, it is a good hygiene skill and my OCD is grabbing onto it. And so I might still brush my teeth because it's a good hygiene skill, but I might practice sitting with the uncertainty of maybe I didn't brush them long enough. Maybe my teeth will still fall out, whatever it is, I'm still practicing sitting with the uncertainty. So that's Elizabeth just asked, when you say you're doing the ERP, what exactly are you doing? If you can give examples of how you stay on top of it. That's a really great example. For whatever reason, the past couple months, every time I'm like going to bed at night, I have this huge spike in distress about brushing my teeth. It's just like if you don't brush your teeth, yeah, all your teeth are gonna fall out and they'll just be horrible. It'll be the worst case scenario ever. No one could even imagine how bad it will be for you, right? And so then what I do instead is I say, okay, I hear you. I'm gonna go brush my teeth, and then I'm not gonna engage with these thoughts. So when those thoughts are like, oh my goodness, you should brush for 5 seconds longer, I'm just like, okay, that's nice. And then I put away my toothbrush and I go lay down, and I don't engage with those thoughts. And so that's a really good example of just what the ERP looks like. Other times I'll notice areas of my life that are consistently showing up, you know, um, where so again, whenever I have, let me just go back a little bit. Whenever I have any sort of zing in the OCD, I do opposite action, right? So that's an example of that with the toothbrushing. I had this little zing, and so I do opposite action. And then whenever I'm noticing an area of my life is consistently getting triggered or triggering the OCD, right? One of my threats, one of my sub threats, scrupulosity, existential harm, whatever it is being a lot harder, then I'll go through and make an actual hierarchy the same way I did in therapy, where I'll, write down all the things I'm avoiding, all the different compulsions I'm engaging with, and I will write them all out, and then I'll practice starting with the lowest level and working my way up. So an example of one that I'm doing today is I've recognized that sometimes my OCD grabs onto sleep and will use sleep as a compulsion. When I don't want to face the day, I will try to sleep to avoid the distress that comes with having a day that's not full or a day that's not perfect, right? And so what I'm doing, since this has been happening for a while, I'm recognizing that this is, becoming a pattern. I'm going and I'm making a hierarchy. So I'm going to write down the things that I'm avoiding. So, for instance, I'm avoiding setting alarms. I'm avoiding making plans early in the morning just in case I need to sleep through my distress. I'm avoiding staying away from the house in places where I can't take naps. I'm looking at all these things I'm avoiding, and then I'm making exposures. So I'm going to practice setting alarms, and maybe I'll set them fairly, late in the day because that feels easier, and I'll work my way up until it's a little earlier, because our goal is to be able to do exposures without engaging in other neutralizers or other compulsions, right? Sometimes I call them neutralizers because I think it makes it easier to conceptualize in my brain what they're doing. But I am just doing what I can, and so if what I can do is set an alarm for 11 a.m., that's what I'll do. And I'll practice that for a week until my distress goes down a little bit. And then I'll move it up and I'll practice staying away from my house and making plans early in the morning and doing all those other things that I've been avoiding. But I've kind of built it out like an exposure hierarchy, um, because I've noticed a pattern that's there. So that's the two things, the opposite action to all the zings that my OCD sends me, and then making exposure hierarchies when I notice patterns. Let's see. How are you able to conquer your OCD and be able to talk about it and not get triggered by it? Um, so a couple of things here. First of all, it still triggers me, right? I still have distress that comes up. I just no longer engage with it, right? I don't have to let it dictate my actions. And when being able to talk about it, I wasn't always. When I first started ERP, I could not talk about it. In fact, I sent an email to my whole family because they knew I was going into therapy for OCD, and I was like, do not ask me about my OCD. I will not answer any questions. I am not comfortable answering anything to do with my mental health. Do not ask. And I went through my, treatment again, 4 months of intensive treatment, and I just kind of had, the symptoms went down, the fear was taken away. I like to describe it like, OCD is a magician, and once you learn the magician's secret, it's no longer that exciting, right? We see that it's not magic, and we are able to recognize, how the magician is pulling off this huge trick, and that's how it feels with my OCD. I was able to see, okay, like this is, a false alarm. This is a magician trying to trick me, but I know what it's doing, and so I'm not going to fall for it, and so I'm going to practice, ignoring it and doing the opposite of what it says, right? And so after doing that enough, I started really small and just sharing with some close friends, um, and then I started sharing on social media. And I remember the first time I posted about OCD, I almost threw up. My distress was 10 out of 10. I was over the moon anxious. It was so hard. I felt so much shame about it, so much confusion, and I didn't even post about it until after I'd been through that intensive therapy. Um, and then, I sat through the distress. The distress went away, and so I just kept doing that and kept doing it. And now I feel really comfortable talking about it. That doesn't mean that it never triggers me. Sometimes I'll talk about it and not not want to. I still have that feeling of, oh, you should be ashamed. And so I combat it by talking about it, right? Doing the opposite. Um, but it was just a very slow process of ERP. I know it's easy to look at people who are in recovery and be like, oh, they went from being so severe to where they are now overnight. Like it feels impossible to do that much work, right? But it was so slow. It was so hard, the hardest thing I've ever done. And it was not this overnight process to get where I am now. It took a whole lot of work. And so I think that, yeah, yeah. Um, is it normal to always feel like you're going to die in a car accident or be murdered? I have horrible OCD about these things all day, every day. A lot of us with OCD have those thoughts, and a lot of people without OCD have those thoughts, right? They just might not assign them so much credit. But I think one thing OCD likes to do is try to figure out if we're normal, right? It wants us to figure out anything, including whether our OCD is manifesting normally. And so sometimes we can lean into this distress there too and practice, acknowledging maybe it's not normal. Maybe you have some really crazy rare case of OCD. Um, and then still showing up to things like this, still showing up to support groups, still showing up to your therapy, still working on it. But I do want to say that those intrusive thoughts are exceptionally normal. Ones I've definitely dealt with a lot. Let's see what other questions we've got. Sarah says, "Do you have any advice for dealing with PMS and insomnia, which makes my intrusive thoughts and ERP more difficult to manage?" I think one thing that's really important to recognize is that oftentimes, my goodness, you guys, so sorry. Keep coughing right in y'all faces. It's so important to recognize that often people with vaginas can experience, um, who experience periods can experience this cycle where like things will get worse right before their period, or increase during, right? Our hormones are changing, and our hormones can really directly influence our OCD. And so again, that idea of expecting and expecting that you'll have ups and downs, and some days will just be really hard, and then accepting it when that happens. and also managing our vulnerability factors, right? There's a whole lot of things that can make us more vulnerable to our OCD. Those things, I always give the example of the triangle that's our mental, or emotional health, our physical health, and our social health, right? And so anything we're doing, so mental health, that's things like therapy, going to groups, going to things like this. Our physical health, that's things like sleeping, eating enough, exercising, all those different things. And our social health is things like, making sure we're socializing and also getting alone time. We need both, right? Um, and everyone needs varying levels of the two. And so if we're able to keep those vulnerability factors, those three areas, if we're able to stay on top of those things, make sure we're eating, make sure we're sleeping, exercising if we can, just doing those little things that can help a lot for those different fluctuations that happen naturally, like when our hormones shift or we just have, for whatever reason, a really bad day. If we're able to manage those things, it can make those days a little bit easier. But then again, accepting and expecting that it will be hard and we'll just have those days that just suck, right? Um, yeah, I think that having a lot of self compassion is also really important in those moments. Um, okay, so Lucy asked, thank you so much for this. You're welcome. I'm wondering if it's sufficient to practice ERP in everyday life, but I struggle to intentionally set up exposures. I do too. It's hard. It's not always fun. It's hard to sit down and do it. I do think a really important part of recovery is not just doing the opposite action to all of OCD's things, right? Not just not engaging with our thoughts and not engaging with the things OCD tells us to do, but also doing the intentional exposures, right? I think there's a whole lot of value to both. And I have found that it's really important for me to do both. Even if I'm only doing the intentional, sitting down and making exposure hierarchies, maybe I only do that like every other month. I still think it's an important part of recovery, and I could probably do that more. Honestly, that's one that I need to do more. Um, let's see. We're almost out of time here. Let me make sure. See if there's any questions I'm getting to. So okay, Eric is asking, I go through a lot of mental compulsions to relieve the anxiety until it feels just right. That everything's fine. Like, yes, I did bring home the right animal. It could be just right OCD. He said, is that just right? I think it could be, but also it sounds like you have a genuine threat here. Like your threat is that you brought home the wrong animal, right? Typically with just right OCD, there is no real threat. It just doesn't feel right. And so, it might be like petting your dog a certain number of times until it feels right. There's not a necessarily like any magical thinking. Like it's not like if I don't pet my dog, then I will die, or this certain bad case scenario will happen. It's more just it doesn't feel right until I do it a certain number of times. And so what you're describing, Eric, doesn't necessarily sound too much like just right OCD. It sounds like your threat is bringing home the wrong animal, right? And whatever the fear is that's there, whether it's just your other dog is suffering or you took someone else's dog, whatever the real underlying threat is, it sounds like there's a genuine concern that's there. Whereas again, the just right OCD is more just that you can't sit with the feeling of just right. Let's see. Let me make sure I'm not getting any, um, let's see. Yes, so sorry. I did just kick the inappropriate man out of the chat. I did not see those comments before. So sorry you guys had to read through those. Um, make sure I get to everyone's questions. Again, we're just about done. How do you get the motivation to push yourself more? I try to cut my cleaning compulsions by setting limits to how long I wash my hands and then shorten even more, but I got stuck at a point. One thing I always say is that you don't just magically wake up with courage, right? You build it every time you're doing those little teeny things, right? And so one thing that is important to remember is that we also sometimes just will not feel motivated. There are so many times when I was doing ARP that I just felt like this is hopeless. I'm not getting anywhere. I'm never going to get anywhere. I should just give up, right? And that's another time where we are able to honor those emotions, let ourselves feel them, and then act more consistently with what our actual values are, right? So acknowledge, hey, like Sophie acknowledge this is going really hard. I'm getting stuck. This is just it feels like I'm not making any progress and I'm feeling defeated or whatever it is you're feeling. And then still do it, right? Still do it even when you don't have the motivation and start really, really, really small. So if you're unable to cut the cleaning compulsions, um, see if you can try something different, right? Um, when we're able to, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. Our so a lot of people are always wondering, how do I know whether I'm doing a compulsion or an exposure that's too hard for me, right? Do I just like feel, oh, this is going to be too hard, so I don't do it? And the answer to whether or not you're doing a compulsion that's too, or sorry, an exposure that's too hard is whether you're able to do it without engaging in other compulsions, right? So if you're able to sit through the distress and not engage with other compulsions, even if your distress is a 10 out of 10, that's still a good exposure to do. But if you're unable to do the exposure without having other compulsions come up, so like if I'm unable to not brush my teeth, without having that's not a not brush my teeth for a very long time without having to pray or do other mental compulsions, then that means that we maybe need to do an exposure that's a little smaller, right? A little easier. And so if you're unable to cut your cleaning compulsions by setting limits, then see if we can try something different. Like maybe instead of cutting down how long it takes to wash your hands, let's try something like, trying a different soap that doesn't feel as effective for your OCD. Like it doesn't seem your OCD is telling you that it's not as effective. You need to use a certain soap. See if you can switch soaps or see if you can do other things to try to just mess up OCD's rhythm. It's kind of like, the Emperor's New Groove, and he's like, you threw me off my groove. That's our goal with OCD, throwing it off its groove. And so if you're able just to mess with it a little bit, try to just change the compulsions that you have, and then sit down with a therapist and make a hierarchy so that you can build up to it. I think that that can help build your motivation because you're seeing those little teeny, teeny, teeny wins and you keep building. Um, I just want to address one thing really quickly. And then I think we'll log off. But this person says, I have pure O. This seems worse than a doorknob checker. I just want to say that there's no type of OCD that's worse than another. Everyone experiences, OCD to varying degrees, and someone can have um just just all experiences are valid. All the different sub threats are all distressing and all hard to deal with. And so the more we compare to each other, the harder it is to get out of the hole that OCD's put us in. If we're instead able to recognize, that this is really hard for me, instead of doing like this is hard for me and it's probably harder than it is for others, if we're just able to sit and validate it for ourselves, I think that can be really helpful. um, but I do understand the place that comes from, that place of hurt and pain, because I know how hard it is. I know how hard pure O is. I know how hard doorknob checking is. And so validate it for yourself and try to practice, not comparing it to others experiences, because in this community, that's the last thing we need, right? We need to be able to support each other and have each other's back and practice validating our experiences and validating others. And so I know we're out of time here. I have to log off because I am running a support group for NoCD, but we'd love to see you guys in those support groups. I run 10 of them every week. And so make sure you go and sign up for some and come and join us, because we would love to have you there and love to get the chance to, keep communicating in this community. I think that this community is such an incredible one. And I love the way we're all able to support each other. So thank you all for tuning in. Hopefully, I'll see you guys next time. But in the meantime, come check out the support groups. We'd love to see you. Make sure you download the NoCD app. That's the best place to sign up and learn more about what we do here. And you can set up a free call with our care team to see if we're able to provide you some therapy. And we would love to see you guys there. So I will catch you guys later. Again, feel free to come say hi on Instagram at Tortilla Wilson. I can also send you guys that false alarm model I talked about earlier. But thank you for tuning in to me with my scratchy throat. And we will see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.